Hello, this is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you our analysis and take on what went down last night during last night's special business board meeting and committee of the whole meeting. How are you doing this morning, Heather?
Great, thank you.
Good. So last night, lots of big topics, lots of things to discuss. I'm interested to hear what initially stood out to you.
Well, I think for me, one of the things that stood out was we saw during the CDD part of the committee of the whole, we saw some initial numbers for how that first lottery went for families choosing their new buildings for the next school year. And what we saw was that really a lot of the demographics, the racial demographics and the participation rates haven't changed in a way that I think the district was hoping that they would. There is going to be a second lottery, which was a solution and something very new. So there's like reserved seats in some of those buildings that normally we just gave away in that first lottery. But I do worry that even with a second lottery, we don't really have a plan for engaging families differently.
Hmm.
I kind of think back to when we were trying to figure out if elementary students were going to go back in person or not and how much work the district did in order to make sure that they heard from 90% of families what they wanted. And I hope that during this second lottery process that we take that decision and we make it as big of a priority to make sure that we connect with all those families in a way that helps them really make the choices that work best for their families.
Yeah. I mean, it was such a like we celebrated it and we said that's the new bar because we know it's possible. We know it's possible for MPS to, have families, engage families and help them make the choices that they need to make. We saw, different online events and we know this year has not gone the way that anyone has planned in terms of how they were planning community engagement, how they were planning connecting with families. And, you know, I think it's a real opportunity that we know that students are going back into buildings now around how we can support and engage families in helping them make those decisions. Um, but that's the bar, and you do anything you can to get to that bar, and around 90%. And obviously, we want to reach 100% too, right? Like 90% is great. It's much better than we've seen before. But we know it's not been a consistent number that Minneapolis Public Schools is able been able to get, and it's just really difficult. And so, yeah, I just think that there's a real opportunity to uh, make sure that families are making the choice, actively making the choice for students. So,
One of the things I was most excited about regarding the CDD and those lotteries was that there were plans to be in different communities, and they were going to do kind of a bookmobile for telling people about their choices. And we know that COVID took those possibilities away. Um, I want to acknowledge that there was a real intention to enter into communities and to do things differently, and but I also hope that we get super creative, as we have all been forced to do, right? And to not just let those limitations define, and to say that the numbers that we saw last night were enough, because they're not.
yeah. And I want to be clear, I think when we talk about, the lottery and placement and all these things, families making their choices is just one part of the equity pie, right? Because we know that, you know, but obviously we want to make sure families get the choices that they want and need in order to be successful. But that's only one part of what builds equity into our entire placement processes. So the fact that Minneapolis is having a second lottery supports that goal of equity, right? I think also the part around Minneapolis reserving seats in magnet schools um, for specific populations is another work towards equity. So whether or not we get all of the necessary, um, whether or not we get all of the necessary participation that the district needs in order to understand, who's in what schools, the fact that those seats are locked for special education students or students who are on free and reduced lunch in magnet schools or whatever, right? I think that's a really, really big key. So this isn't to say if Minneapolis fails at, getting a whole new group of parents to participate in the choice process that has never happened before, like they have failed at trying to achieve equity and the CDD fails. That's not the whole story, right? But it is an important part in thinking about how are we engaging our communities, because the other parts of this equity pie are there, and I think what we need to be vigilant of is the placement office going to revert back to old practices around making exceptions for people who are very, very vocal, who are very, very loud, and are making very, very clear demands around what schools they want to be in, what schools they don't want to be in? Or is Minneapolis going to be able to create the hard line to say, no, X school is closed to, students outside of their community? Certain high schools are at capacity, right? Are they going to be able to say that? Because that is where the equity line starts to break down. And so I think there are lots of moving pieces here in order to manage and kind of figure out, is equity happening with our placement? And it is important. It is 100% important that the district engages those families that haven't participated in the choice process yet and traditionally don't. And the second lottery is an attempt to say this is not a first come first serve situation anymore, right? And I think that's great. But also there are these other things that are happening that we also need to be aware of and pay attention to, in terms of, is equity actually happening or is it breaking down? And so, yeah, I think that's just important to acknowledge.
And also, I just think, you know, I would just like to say, as a white person, I hope that we all, white people, I hope that we all can just hit pause for a moment when we get those placement letters in mid March and really just think about like what we value. What do we value in this city? What do we value for our children? Who do we value? Who gets to clog up the phone lines that day? Who gets to make demands and have meltdowns on social media? You know, I just hope that we can really think about our actions beyond ourselves. It'll be an interesting thing if we actually kind of hold this line of saying some people can't overfill crowded schools because that's their preference, and we'll just keep building on wings to those schools while we can't figure out why these buildings over here don't have what they need.
Yeah.
It'll be very interesting to see if our city has the courage to do this.
Yep. Yeah, I would love to see, and this might serve as a good transition point, but I would love to first of all be, a but or like to be a fly in the wall of like the placement office phone calls and hear after the letters go out what those conversations are. Because I think about, when we think about like white families clogging up those lines because they're not happy about the schools they got into or what their choice is, instead of allowing that capacity to go towards students who need special education services and are concerned about like whether that school is able to provide that level of service that they need, right? Like that is a very, very, very big need in this city. And if our system is, you know, busy trying to answer, oh, I didn't get into this magnet school that I really, really wanted to, or oh, I don't like this community school. I put my first option as this other community school and I hate it. Like the fact of the matter is that Minneapolis Public Schools value is trying to ensure that every neighborhood school serves students well, right? And so if you got into your neighborhood school, like that shouldn't be the end of the world. I understand maybe you wanted to get into a specific magnet school and you would love to try to figure out how to make sure that happens for your child. But also there are families that like really need help navigating the system because they have needs that, are very challenging to meet.
Yep,
But
yep.
if the system collapses because one group of families is, or groups of families that are just upset about where they're being placed, that doesn't necessarily mean it's only one group of families, right? It's not just white families in Southwest Minneapolis that are going to feel this way. There are going to be lots of families that are upset about their choices, or where they're placed. But if the system is responding to those concerns, then and they can't respond to the concerns around, what special education students are looking for and what needs they have that they need to be met, we're not getting anywhere closer to serving our most marginalized students.
Yeah, we can't continue to like tap a finite system and then blame it for being finite.
Yep,
Yeah.
100%. So this served as a good transition point because special education students were a major topic last night, in some regards, and in some regards were skipped over last night. And so, Heather, where did you want to start in terms of talking about special education students?
You know, one of the things that I heard Associate Superintendent Cox say was that federal setting three kiddos were going to be able to go back in school a full week earlier than other students, and so it was an opportunity for them to kind of get into the buildings to get some routines established. I thought that showed a lot of thought and care about helping them to acclimate back into in person if that's what their families choose. I worry a little bit about like naming the settings versus allowing families who know their students best to say this child, might be a different federal setting, but maybe this child needs to be in this room better and like would do better with all the chaos. So, it was different than we saw for elementary, which shows that we can take feedback, take what didn't work, and change, which I think is an incredible amount of shifting for a thing as big as MPS and a pandemic. I thought it showed greatness. I hope we can listen to families who think their kids might need that week.
Yeah. And I do think it's really, really important that, we have the ability to ensure students who receive special education service get the space to be able to go into their buildings, create routines, create the support mechanisms they need, and just have, the focus be on them before, we have all of our students go back who are then all going to be navigating different setting, different spaces, different places. Um, and we also know that special education students have not been served very well through distance learning. And so that additional in-person time, that targeted focus, that targeted support is going to be crucial. And I think it's a good move to be really responsive to the needs of the community. I know that the governor was the one that said we need to provide in-person supports for students, and I'm glad that the district is looking at creating scaffolding up and escalating the engagement and starting with special education students who have very, very clearly been left out of this conversation, and left out of educational opportunities. And we also know that students of color, Black students, are way over identified in our special education system. And so we are just not just serving special education students, but we're overwhelmingly underserving a population that is students of color, which continues to get at this point of racial equity. And it's just been a really, really challenging year, obviously, on so many fronts. And so I'm glad that there's some intentionality around who's coming into the building and how we can provide that support.
Yeah, the thing we didn't hear as far as like a special ed update last night was there was supposed to be time for question and answer for the board regarding special education and literacy. And we kind of are feeling this trend when it comes to literacy that we get super short on time. And I think, I know that there were a lot of people who were tuned in last night because they really wanted to hear, they had questions that they wanted to hear asked. And then we didn't get to ask any questions. And I recognize, like, whatever. In the meantime, we have to send middle school back and high school back. And I recognize that, like, this comes up. But also, like, this is that dilemma we find ourselves in all the time where we're constantly reacting to a crisis and then we're not preparing for the future. And so I'm disappointed that we didn't have question and answer time for literacy and special education.
Yeah, I mean, people have pointed out to me that a few years ago there's a special education audit, and they were saying that our special education students or our kids can't read because our special education students cannot read because our students cannot read, right? And so when we continue to shortchange literacy after it's become a priority for the district, and for the board to listen to throughout the year, it's challenging. And yeah, you're right. We were upset last month that they didn't do the CDD update, because the board was promised to get a CDD update every month. And so there's always something that's going to kind of the um, fall off the agenda, and we can't make enough time for everything. Um, but yeah, we're a district that struggles in literacy. We're a district that struggles to make time for literacy and to discuss literacy. And for those who are listening, we want to reassure you that the board did submit their questions via email, and then receive responses to them. So at the very least, the board got their questions answered. That didn't happen publicly for all of us to digest, which I think is the concern that we have right now. But I just think we need to figure out, how are we going to really take a look at our literacy issues and say, how are we going to make it a priority with our time, our money, our energy,
Our
our
plan.
our plan. How are we going to listen to respected and sound research about the science of literacy? So yeah, there's just so many things there, and so we just need to figure it out. I don't know, and I don't know the right answer, right? Because rightfully so, we should have gotten a COVID response, and an update on what's going on in terms of return to in person. We should have gotten a CDD update because we skipped it in January, and we need to make sure that that's continuing to happen, and how that's happening, and what's going on. And enrollment numbers were important to hear, and also so was special education and literacy. So it's a hard balance.
Speaking of balance, the other balance that we need to talk about is this elephant in the room of whether or not we should test students right now, as they're either returning or not returning. There's just a lot of conversations about testing in our city right now, and I feel complicated ways about it. But what did you think about the conversation in testing last night?
Um, I thought the conversation around testing it was my do better moment. If you watched our shorter video, it's my do better moment. And so I think the conversation around testing can't just be, oh, don't test our students to death, they're traumatized, all of these different things. But the conversation around testing needs to be, we need to understand the impact of the pandemic on our students and on our system. And we need to understand what resources, what investments do we need to make? What do we need to realign to, meet the educational crisis that this pandemic has caused in our city? But it felt like yesterday the conversation was really leaning towards, oh, we have to do this, we don't want it. It was just like a burden. It was a nuisance. It was something that we might as well just disregard, honestly, because you know clearly our students are struggling. And so what are the MCAs going to tell us about that? And I respected I believe it's Director Elameen's comment around, we need to figure out the balance between instructional time and testing, because we have one quarter with our secondary students and our middle school students and in person this year. So what are we going to do about that? So I
That's
understand
assuming we
that,
don't spend some of that time in quarantine.
right? And so I understand that, and I think that's a valid question to be asking. But I think we have to go a step further in saying, how do we maximize our instructional time, and how do we maximize the amount of information and data that we can get to understand to what degree that this pandemic has exacerbated our gaps? Because we keep saying it, and it's a thing to say now, is like, oh, we've had gaps and we've worsened them. But if you're not taking active steps to understand how big this impact has created, and then what we're going to do about it, then you just have a talking point that doesn't mean anything. As opposed to saying, like, there are second graders, first graders, sixth graders who haven't been in their buildings for the entire year, who had been behind. And we need to know now how much further behind they're going to be going into their new grade next year, and what investments do we have to make with this new, federal money that should be coming down the pipe, right? Like all these different things. But it just felt like we want to hide from the data. We're afraid of the information, and we'd rather explain away the information and the data, as opposed to saying like, this data may not be perfect, right? It's racially biased, whatever, but it's more information than us just saying we know it's there, right? We don't know what exactly it impacted. We don't know how, like, did it set us back 5 months? Did it set us back 2 quarters, a full year? Did summer slide plus the pandemic, set us back, some students back 2 years? Like, we just don't know.
Yeah, and I do wonder about the like, if not that test, then what, right? And that's where I think I don't hear the answer. So if we don't test, then what do we do in this space of not knowing what kids need to know? And if I can hear good answers for that, maybe I can go with the no testing, but I don't know what that looks like. I mean, and maybe that's just a lack of my ability to envision a world in which we don't do things the same old way. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that they're, you know, we didn't do the fast tests. We didn't make it mandatory for every student, so we lost a lot of information. And then we like, oh shoot, we actually really need that information. And that information is real time. Like, how can I intervene with students in this moment? And that's important information to know. And also, the MCAs provide information around across the system on a whole bevy of information for our policymakers to say, oh, maybe we don't need to prioritize this. Like, the MCAs provide the information for the policymakers to decide where we should allocate our resources. And we don't always talk about our MCA results in that way, right? We again talk about our MCA results in terms of like this. Of course, this is happening. It's happened every year, and yeah, in any other year, in 2016, if you would have skipped the MCAs, you could have probably looked at the 2013, 14, 15 data and
Hmm.
guessed where we were going to end up in 2016 with within a reasonable amount of um, error, right? But we don't know what the this the pandemic and distance learning threw a curveball on us, and we don't know actually how effective distance learning was. And I think about the fact that we have students who go through online learning in Minneapolis public schools, and who do credit recovery. And while those systems need to be audited, we know that we don't actually know how effective they are in ensuring that students are getting the gains that they need to make in those spaces. And so then we just expanded that system that's reserved for a small group of students to all 32 33,000 students in our city, and we don't know the impact of what that had. And I just don't understand why policymakers in our city would want to say like, it's not a priority for us. Don't, basically, like, district, don't worry about it. If it happens, it happens. It has to happen because the state and federal government are telling us it has to happen. But we'll figure out a different way to figure out where our resources should go. I don't know what they would listen to.
Yeah, I'm open to that suggestion. I do admit that I find the testing conversation to be really overwhelming because I think for me, when my kids have taken the fast test, it's always been a good barometer for me. I don't always necessarily get so hung up on the MCAs, but you know, I mean, it's not like students of color get access to to higher learning opportunities when they perform or don't perform well on those tests anyway. I mean, I have a friend whose children always performed well on the MCAs, and she still had to fight for her black sons to get into advanced math. They told her repeatedly that they couldn't do the work. So I mean, I don't know.
And
It's
I mean,
complicated.
and I think that, and this is going beyond just like what happened at the board meeting last night, but that that example right there is so interesting because of the fact around how much we devalue like the MCAs, where black children could be doing well, but because a white counselor who serves as a gatekeeper into advanced academics says you won't do well, but objective information on that, like the MCA says you're fine, like you could do this. Like that's what's maddening. Like we think that, oh, the MCAs are, this like terribly racist system, whatever, and that's fine to think that, I guess, but what's the alternative? Like all of these adults who operate in an institutionally racist system making these decisions and saying like, oh yeah, you think that um, because of what you think should determine what opportunities my child gets, who, again, operating in an institutionally racist system, who operates in a white supremacist society, like you want to ignore the objective information and use your best ability or your best judgment to say whether students are getting access to higher opportunities, and then we see, oh wait, students of color don't actually get access to those opportunities. Like it's just mind-boggling to me how we can have this conversation in this way and say the alternative is having an overwhelmingly white group of staff, faculty members make these decisions as opposed to like utilizing the data to make those decisions.
There are no easy solutions to this conversation, but I think we have to keep having it, and we have to keep having it in the context of how we are currently underserving students of color. Like that's the key part. It's like this is all happening in a thing that's already really broken.
Yeah. So, well, those are all the things that really stuck out to me from the board meeting. What about you, Heather?
I think that's it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to debrief this and engage in this conversation. I know all these issues have two sides to these stories, are so difficult to grapple with. And I hope we gave you all some more things to chew on, some different points to consider. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Bye.